Amen. About 2 years ago, I was on a trip with my oldest son, Judah. It was his graduation present, and we had gone overseas for his graduation. We had flown through Amsterdam, out of the States, I think is up through New York, if I remember correctly, then through Amsterdam, and then into Edinburgh, Scotland. And of course, when we got to Edinburgh, we've already had several flights, and the COVID lines, the check-in lines in Amsterdam were just running all the way down the airport terminal. Even though you're already checked in, you're already through security, you had to get back in a COVID line to make sure your paperwork was correct to travel. We barely made the plane. And of course, I knew right away, when you have barely made a plane, your luggage is in trouble. And of course, we showed up in Edinburgh ready for vacation, ready. We were visiting some of my family members who are missionaries, and we're just waiting for the luggage, waiting. It never came. We went to file a report. There was very little help at the service desk. People seemed to be not there that day because of whatever constraints, COVID related. They were understaffed. We wandered around. We looked, we wandered. Finally, we left the airport, and basically what the idea is, you just need to go and call it in to the airline, and you need to make a claim. So I did that. Very first thing. We got to the place we were staying, and the very first thing, I started working on our luggage. Day one would go by, no word. Day two, I would call and get to people on the line, on the phone, and begin to negotiate. Well, sir, we are tracking it. Well, sir, we're looking for it. We will get it to you as soon as possible. We've got your track. Are you sure you got my tracking number? Are you sure you got us? You know where to bring. Blah, 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 back and forth, back and forth. Day two comes by, no luggage. At this point in time, my sister's encouraging us. Listen, the airline has provisions. Go buy some clothes. Go buy a toothbrush. Go buy some things. And so we begin to get some cords to charge phones and to spend. And this is making me more and more nervous because we're spending money. And of course, the airlines later on are going to want to nitpick about what you've spent and track every single receipt before they reimburse you. I'll never forget on day three, I'm on the phone, and it was, sir, we found your baggage. And I'm like, listen, I know you've got my bag. You got to get it to us. We're no longer near the airport. And I'll remember this famous line, okay, sir, we're going to make you a priority. And she asked me this question, would you like to escalate your claim? And I thought, boy, yeah, of course I would like. Send that thing to the top. Send that claim to your manager. No, send it to your manager's manager. It's day 3 now. Our vacation is slowly unraveling because we've got no clothes. Yes, I would like to escalate my claim. Yes, ma'am, very much. Please do so, with frustration in my voice, trying to be as polite as I can. Escalate my claim. We've been studying a series of conflicts in the book of Mark. It's Mark's conflict stories. Mark begins introducing Jesus and a little bit of who he is and his call to the disciples and his healing, his miraculous power. And then as we learn a little bit about the foundations of who Jesus is, it moves into a series of conflicts. And each one of these conflicts, people are coming against him, the religious community, and they're questioning who he is. They're questioning his claims. Questioning his claims. And in today's 2 stories, it's almost as if Mark says, yes, let's escalate the claims of Christ. Let's raise the stakes one more level. Let's raise the bar. Let's raise the consequences. Let's raise the implications of his authority to its highest point in the minds of the people. Let's escalate his claims. You see, in both of these situations today, there's one central issue: the Sabbath. And keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath was the Jewish day of observance in obedience to the law of the Lord, their day of rest. It would run from Friday night to Saturday afternoon. It is the most holy day to the Jewish people, the most holy day to the land of Israel, the land of Galilee where Jesus is ministering. All of Jewish life revolved around the Sabbath. And so, of course, religious tradition, Judaism, had very carefully and thoroughly worked out all of the details of how to keep the Sabbath. Every last little detail. How to protect it, how to maintain it, how to obey it. And there was, beyond God's law to keep the Sabbath, there were all kinds of traditions and regulations about what you could or could not do. And this was very, very sacred to the Jewish people. And this morning we're going to see Mark escalate the claim of Jesus to being even authoritative over the Sabbath, over the most sacred institution for his people and his land. Jesus will demonstrate his authority over this sacred day, and he will make two basic claims with very serious implications. And if you're following in your notes on the bulletin, you'll see points 1 or 2 are these incredible claims, raising the stakes about who Jesus is. And then point 3 is sort of our concluding point. It's the result of these claims. It's the result of what happens and what begins to take shape not only in Jesus' life, but in the disciples' life and in the chapters to come when we get to them in the summer. So let's look at these incredible claims, this escalation of who Jesus is this morning in these two quick stories about the Sabbath. Number 1, we learn in this first story that Jesus has authority over the created order and provision. Jesus has authority over God's creation, how he made things, what order he made them in, what's prioritized. And he also has authority over God's provision for his world, for his creation. Let's pick up where we left off last week in Mark chapter 2 and verse 23. One Sabbath, right, there's your setup. This is a big deal. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began, they may have been really hungry. It doesn't say begged. They began to pick some heads of grain. Some heads of grain. Begin to eat, begin to munch a little bit. Now, this was allowed in Jewish law. If you walk through a guy's field and you're hungry, you had a little flexibility to take some of the fruit or, appropriate amounts. The problem is it's on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And he answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions," David's an ancient Israelite king, the most important king of Israel. "Have you never read what David did, this king, when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God," Jesus says, "and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Notice carefully the actions of this story of King David that Jesus quotes in his own defense. David has gone into the place of God, the house of God, and he has given some of the bread not only to himself but to his companions. Now, we have a lot of unlawful eating in the Burbacher house. A lot of unlawful eating. And at night, from time to time, I might like to have a caffeine-free, sugar-free soda, just something a little bit at night. And my wife, she'll buy a case of them, and they will go in the refrigerator, and they will sit there for whenever I have a hankering for a taste of soda. And there are a number of people in my household living there. They're living rent-free. grocery free. My children are there, right? And one of my children, I'm not going to say which one. We'll narrow it down to the 3 boys. That'll be enough for you. We'll have to say, listen, these are Dad's sodas, right? And this child will ask, Dad, can I have a soda? I say, all right, buddy, you can have one of my soda. I appreciate God's creation, all he's made, and I would love to give some to you, share some with my companions. And I'll walk in 3 days later, and I won't even have had one soda. And when I go in there, half the case is gone. Half the case. Somebody's been sneaking in to get my soda. Now, if you know anything about law and food in the Burbacher house, this is happening to brownies and Doritos. If it is not clearly marked, there seems to be enough gray area, enough wiggle room that all the Burbacher laws are thrown out the window and everything's open, right? We've got a sneaky food eater who likes to skirt the laws a little bit. Here's what's so curious about this fun story that Jesus tells about David. It's actually, though it sounds like David is a sneaky food eater who skirts by the law, it's actually not a story at all about sneaking and skirting by. It's actually a very bold story about very bold authority. It sounds to our ears like David's just kind of skirting the gray areas here, but that's not what they would have heard. That's not what Mark intends or what Jesus intends. What do you mean? This is not an illustration about someone slipping in to get food and the priest just kind of let him skirt by. No, Jesus uses this example as an example of authority. How do you mean, Pastor Chad? You see, they were going to understand that only the priests have the authority to access the house of God and the sacred bread of the Lord in the house of the Lord. And only the priests could do this on the sacred days of the Lord. If there was somebody who had authority as great as the priest or even over the priest in this situation, there might only be one person in all the land with higher authority, and that would be the anointed, chosen king. You see, God had anointed and chosen the priest to have this authority. He had delegated them authority over the house of God and over the bread of God and over the days of God and the stewardship of God's things. And there was only one other person in all the land who had this delegated authority, and it was the anointed king. The anointed king. And so Jesus utilizes a picture of David, who, like the priests, was also chosen and anointed and given delegated human authority, and therefore in a time of need had the authority to take the bread and to graciously give it to his companions. Jesus is saying something very specific. He is saying, I've got authority like David had. But there's more. Again, we're escalating the claims and we're raising the stakes. And so Jesus makes an even greater appeal to an even older story than the story of David. As Jesus claims to have authority over all created order and over God's provision, he says this in verse 27. He continues. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And verse 28. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now again, it's easy for us to read this verse with a bit of shallow understanding. It can appear at first glance that Jesus is doing what is unlawful to the people around him, what should not be done. They are harvesting grain. And this was the law that kept them from doing this on the Sabbath. It was an act of harvest. You're not allowed to harvest your crops on the Sabbath. And Jesus leads the disciples through the grain fields, and they start picking, and they start eating a little bit. Well, this, in the minds of the religious leaders, this is an act of harvest. They're breaking the law. And so here, even when we see in this statement, Jesus gives an answer. He says, well, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It sounds like he's kind of giving a lazy response. It sounds like he's saying, hey, everybody relax. God gave us all a day off. It's okay. It's no big deal. That's what it sounds like he's saying. But he's actually doing something very powerful and something very big in the theme of our story today. And we need to see this what? It's not an appeal to relax because God gave us a day of rest. It is an appeal to creation itself. Look at the phrase here, made for man. That is taking their minds all the way back to the book of Genesis. And it's taking their minds all the way back to God's order in creation. That after God had made the world and called it all good, God himself had already made man. And he takes a day of rest and he gives man a day of rest. Jesus is not just saying, hey, relax, guys. No, he is saying, God made the world. And I know how its principles work. He's making another claim to authority. And we need to see this appeal to the creation story as an appeal to his own authority over creation. You say, Pastor Chad, I just don't see it. Look at the second line. To help you see it and understand it, Jesus, again, for the second time in Mark, calls himself the Son of Man. He calls himself the divine figure we learn about in the prophet Daniel, who alone can approach the Ancient of Days, and for whom all things are made. All the nations, all the people are designed to serve the Son of Man. In this second picture, in the first picture, he appeals to David, a human figure with delegated authority. But in this second image, it's not just about delegated human authority, but it is about the celestial figure, the Son of Man, who has divine, heavenly authority over creation and its order and its provision. And while it seems like he's disregarding man's laws, this is what he gets in trouble for. He's ignoring Jewish law to some degree. Listen carefully. Jesus is not going around God's law. He's not sliding by in a gray area. He is doing something very different. He is claiming to be the unique person, both human and divine, with all authority over all the law. Both over its practice and its original purposes. What was the purpose of the Sabbath? It was to be God's provision for man. And thus, as Jesus walks his disciples through the grain fields, and he lets them pick and harvest grain so they can eat, he is fulfilling God's purposes and God's law before their very eyes. And human wineskins, old human traditions cannot contain the God of the universe. Catch in this verse that the Son of Man is Lord over. He has authority over the Sabbath. Catch this language of purpose and creation, because it feeds right into the next story. And I would put this verse 28, at the heart of these two stories we're looking at. This is our pivot point. We get the first story about David, we get the principle. The Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath. And then we're going to get a second story that shows the same thing. Number 2, Jesus uses his authority for our good and our life. He uses this authority for our good and for our life. Don't forget the creation language now. Everybody holding on to it back here in your minds? Is it tickling your mind a little bit? Creation, right? Mark 3 and verse 1. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue. This is the place of God, right? And there's a man with a shriveled hand there. And some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him, the man, on the Sabbath. Notice this is a Sabbath issue again, right? Because Mark has raised the stakes. Both of these conflict stories are about the most holy day, the Sabbath. Does he have authority over the most sacred day to us? Because this is the Sabbath again, the most important day for the Jewish people. There was even, yes, believe it or not, there was Sabbath law for the practice of medicine. For the practice of medicine. If you were a physician in those days, you could work 6 days a week, but you weren't allowed to practice your healing work. You weren't allowed to be a doctor on the Sabbath day. All work ceases on the Sabbath day. Even the work of the physician stops on the Sabbath day. So if somebody has a sore throat and they need a little drop of medicinal herb or something to soothe their sore throat and they need a little bit of instructions about what to do, you can go get that from your physician during the week. You can't go on the Sabbath. The physician's not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Everybody got the picture? And so they know that there's sickness among them. They know that there's the need for healing. And this is why they're watching Jesus closely. In fact, Sabbath law states that there was only 2 exceptions for healing. Only 2 exceptions for life on the Sabbath. One was if the person's own life was in danger. If somebody's life was in danger, they needed their wounds bound, the physician could do the work. Why? Because the principle of life trumps the principle of Sabbath. So they could break Sabbath, do work to save the life. The other exemption for Sabbath work, for healing work, was with a mother who had come to full term and was giving birth. And for the sake of the pregnancy and for the sake of the life of the mother and the child, this Sabbath law to cease from work could be broken and physicians could work and the ladies that help, I'm slipping of the name. What are the names of the ladies? The midwives, yes. The midwives could help deliver the baby. They could work and they would not be breaking Sabbath law. 2 exemptions for life. But here they are in the synagogue. And surely Jesus has had time. He has time all week long for his healing ministry. Okay, that's okay. We'll watch and take note. But now it's a Sabbath day and there's sick people around and they watch to see what he would do. Verse 3. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Isn't it interesting? Sometimes Jesus keeps quiet about a miracle. But in this case, he says, in front of everyone, stand up. He makes a public demonstration. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, the religious leaders and everyone, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? Notice what's the obvious answer: to do good. Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To save life or to kill? Well, it's definitely not to destroy life. But they remained silent. There are times in my home when someone or something is a little bit sensitive, a little bit touchy, right? It's never me. It's never me. No, that's not true. And as parents, as a dad, I just can't help myself sometimes. I'm trying. If I see a grumpy teenager, I might say something and it's the wrong time, it's the wrong joke, it's the wrong instruction for the wrong person, and yet I know a little bit in my guilty heart that I'm doing, and I can see my wife looking, Well, she's nodding her head. And what will she say to me? You know some of these phrases. She'll say, why are you poking the bear? Don't do that. Don't do that right now. Has anybody ever heard that phrase, poking the bear? Don't poke the bear. The other one we use a lot is just don't press any buttons right now. Anybody say that? Maybe spouses. You know all the buttons just to press my buttons. You're just trying to press my buttons, aren't you? And the other spouse is laughing. Yeah, right? There's another good phrase, just let sleeping dogs lie. You ever heard that one? Just let sleeping dogs lie. We might be thinking, Jesus, don't poke the bear. You've got conflict after conflict after conflict. And yet, what does he do? He provokes in this story the healing incident. He says to the man, hey, stand up. Knowing everybody's watching, everybody's looking for a reason to accuse him. Jesus provokes the issue. But again, it's not just about provoking for provoking's sake. Jesus is about to dive in to something deeper, to something divine, to something authoritative in a point of illustration and demonstration to them about himself. A powerful claim is at stake in the nature of his question. Think about his question just for a moment longer. In this question, he traps his opponents. They really don't have any answer they can give. Of course it is lawful to do good, and of course it is lawful to save life. And of course it is never lawful to do evil or to destroy life. But they have no answer. Why? Because if they answer, well, it's lawful to do good, and it's lawful to save life, then they are unwittingly playing right into Jesus' hand. And they are unwilling, admitting to his authority to do what God does in creation and through the Sabbath. What does God do? God is a good God who does good things. And when he makes the world, he says it is good. And what does God do in his authority over mankind? He breathes what? Life into man, and he gives life to mankind. And because he gives life, God is known as the God for doing good and for giving life. And if they say, yes, it's lawful for you to do good, they're making an admittance that they don't want to admit, that he has this authority that he's claiming to have. And of course, they can't say, well, maybe a little evil. No, you shouldn't do evil on any day. You shouldn't take life on any day. You're going to protect the life that God gives. There's one question mark in their minds. One question. Okay, Jesus, you got us here. It's lawful to do good, but you can only heal on the Sabbath if life is in danger. So they would disagree over that third one. Yes, it's lawful to do good. No, don't do evil. Saving life. We're not sure if you can do that, because surely a man with a shriveled hand, his life is not at risk. Surely, Jesus, you can wait till the Sabbath is over and then heal the man. You should not be breaking Sabbath law, because this is not an issue of salvation for this man. He's had the shriveled hand for years and got along just fine. He lives a very full life, Jesus. Surely. And what does Jesus do? He says, stand up before them. Stand up before them. And again, Jesus, he's appealing to the laws of creation itself, and he's appealing to the character of the Creator himself, and he's appealing in his authority over the laws and the traditions and the commentary of man over these things. And just keep this in mind. Is this a saving issue? Verse 5. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their hardness of hearts. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out. And the hand was completely restored. You see, in Jesus' mind, the very act of his presence and authority over God's creation, the very act to heal, the very act to say, yes, I will save a life. He is saying, because I'm here with you, salvation has begun. The age of saving is now. Today is the day of salvation, and I will qualify who needs saving. And what looks like on the outward appearance to you, oh, he can get by another day. No, all men need salvation, and I'm here. So the answer is yes, I'm saving a life. It might be hard for us to picture such a life-changing miracle. The author C.S. Lewis makes a noble attempt in a children's story about a lion who is a Christ-like figure. And this lion has authority to heal and to restore. I keep a copy up on my shelf in my office study. From time to time, we'll look at it for a quote, for illustrations such as this one. It's called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's about evil in the land. It's about a lion who comes to set free and to save. And there's a time at the end of the story where all of these creatures, these mythical creatures, have been held captive by evil. They've been held captive by the witch. How are they held captive? It's not a coincidence that they're made hard. They're turned to stone. They're turned to stone, and they're in this evil fortress where this witch has held them captive and turned them to stone, and she's kept everything winter all the time and never Christmas, and yet now the lion is on the scene. And I don't know how you would picture a healing or a miracle. Perhaps a little bit of imagination would help us picture something so powerful. And I want to show you a brief clip where they approach the friend of the children, and they're broken over their friend, this mythical figure Tumnus. They're broken over him because he's been turned to stone by the queen. But now the lion is there, and he's on the scene. And with a quiet breath, restoration comes. Take a look. You can hear very quietly in the soundtrack, a beating heart starts beating and thumping as he comes back to life. You see, when Jesus appears on the scene, this is exactly what Mark is saying. He's not just giving proof of his authority over the Sabbath. There is a more powerful message at stake. Mark is saying, this is the age of the king. This is the age of the lion. This is the age, the new age of salvation and restoration for all who are bound by evil. This is the age of melting hard hearts and transforming lives. This is the claim of his authority, beyond and over all human authority. And that leads us to a tragic result of these two great claims. A tragic result over this claim, because these religious leaders knew exactly what was going on, that he was claiming authority over good and life. Number 3, we learn that Jesus is then a threat to competition. He is a threat to competing authorities. And I won't spend much time on this as we close, but what if the laws of the Sabbath containing the Sabbath could not be contained in the new wine? What if the laws concerning the Sabbath? What if Jesus was no mere transgressor of the law? What if his actions and his claims were a threat to their entire understanding of human history and power and authority? What if all that we've been saying is true and you've been holding on tightly to man's traditions and forms as a Jew? Well, the conclusion you should figure out by now. If Jesus is a threat to human authority, Mark 3 and verse 6. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians. This is a political group, of how they might kill Jesus. And thus ends part 1 of Mark. This is the end of Mark's first major section. But why? Why does Mark end this section of conflict with this ominous threat of the death of Jesus? Why does he carefully present Jesus' credentials only to end with a statement that they're out to kill him? Why? Because of what's coming in part 2. What's coming next? In Mark's gospel, we'll see how it's not only Jesus who will face the conflict, but in part 2, in chapters 3 through 8, it will be the disciples themselves who will face the storms of life and doubts about Jesus' authority. It will be the disciples themselves who face the critics, who face the opposition, who face the counting the cost to the cross. It will be the disciples themselves who are drawn into the conflict and into the challenge in their own commitments to Christ. It will be the disciples themselves who face times of wavering in their faith. So what is Mark telling us? In these first 3 chapters, he is reminding us that the gospel lays a firm foundation concerning the work of Christ that cannot be shaken in our own call to discipleship. Why? Because in 3 through 8, the disciples are going to be shaken to their core. And Mark is reminding us that when our faith is wavering, when there are storms, when there are needs we're unable to meet, when we are prone to spiritual blindness, when we're prone to spiritual deafness will come up, when we are prone to spiritual hardness of heart, as we'll see in 3 through 8. This will come up again and again. When our faith is shattered by doubts, Mark is saying, remember Jesus, remember the foundations. Why? Because his credentials deserve our commitment as disciples. So I'll end the same way Mark ends. Think of his credentials when you're struggling. Think of heaven opening up and the voice of God confirming him. Think of the presence of the Spirit anointing Jesus for ministry. Think of him when he proclaimed the good news of the kingdom. Think of him when he says, I'll make you something new. I'll make you fishers of men. When he heals the sick and the demon-possessed and cleanses the leper, and he says to the paralytic, child, your sins are forgiven. And he says, follow me, to a tax collector, and he feasts with sinners, and he brings the new wine of the kingdom of God. And now you know to think of him who is Lord over the Sabbath. I want you to stand with me with your heads bowed and your eyes closed. Father, we love you.
Thank you for watching our video. If you liked it, share it with a friend and subscribe to our channel. We go live every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can also support us by clicking the Give button. This allows us to continue to impact our community as well as help missions across the globe with the love of Jesus Christ. Thanks again for watching.